She was already at the balcony railing before she made the decision. That was the part nobody would ever believe, that there was no dramatic internal monologue, no trembling moment of courage, no tear sliding prettily down a porcelain cheek. One moment Seraphina Ashwood was standing at the altar of St. George's, Hanover Square, her gloved hand resting in the damp, thick-fingered grip of Viscount Aldrich Pemberton, and the next she was looking down at 40 feet of open air and thinking, with extraordinary calm, that is survivable. The garden path below was stone. The hedgerows were dense. The drop was steep enough to guarantee broken bones if she landed wrong, and certain death if she landed worse. She let go of the railing anyway. The wind caught the skirts of her wedding gown first, 15 yards of ivory silk billowing upward in a tremendous, undignified rush, and for one suspended, weightless second, Seraphina Ashwood was neither bride, nor fugitive, nor the ruined daughter of a ruined house. She was simply falling. The sky was the pale washed blue of an English spring morning, and it occurred to her, distantly and almost pleasantly, that it was a very fine day to destroy her entire life. Then something caught her. Not the hedgerow. Not the stone path. Something warm and solid, and entirely unexpected. Two arms closing around her with a force that knocked the breath from her body and swung her sideways, and drove whoever had caught her backward 3 full steps before momentum surrendered and they both crashed, miraculously upright, against the iron garden gate. The impact rattled her teeth. The silence that followed rang loudly between her ears. Seraphina opened her eyes. She was being held, cradled, really, in a way that would have been almost romantic under any other circumstances, by a man she had never seen from this angle, which was extremely close and slightly upward, his jaw a sharp dark line above her and his expression one of such absolute, volcanic stillness that she could not tell, for 3 entire seconds, whether he was furious or simply concentrating. Then he looked down, and she looked up, and the bottom dropped out of the world in an entirely different way than it had 30 seconds ago. She knew that face. She had spent 5 years learning to hate that face, the black hair, the charcoal eyes, the blade-straight nose and the mouth that always looked like it was passing quiet judgment on everything those charcoal eyes fell on. She knew the Ravenscroft signet ring on his right hand. She knew the precise quality of his stillness, because she had watched it across a dozen ballrooms with her teeth clenched and her fan held very tightly. Dorian Blackwell, the Duke of Ravenscroft, looked down at the woman in the wedding gown in his arms and said, with perfect, infuriating composure, "A pleasure to see you again, Lady Seraphina." And Seraphina, dangling 40 feet below where she was supposed to be, marrying a man she despised, in the arms of a man she hated, with absolutely no plan and no future, and no idea what happened next, said, "Put me down." He did. She immediately grabbed the gate to stop herself from falling again, which somewhat undermined the dignity of the request, and they stood there in the garden of Ashwood House with the distant sound of the wedding guests inside beginning, very slowly, to notice that something had gone terribly wrong.
If you've ever found yourself rooting for a runaway bride falling straight into disaster, you are in exactly the right place. Welcome to the Duchess Library, where every page holds a treasure. Before we go further, if you are new here, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell, because this story is about to pull you under and you will not want to miss a single scene. Like this video, share it with someone who needs a little Regency chaos in their life, and let's get into it. Because this is where it truly begins.
3 days before the wedding, Seraphina had not been planning to jump from anything. She had been planning to endure. Endurance was, after all, what the past 5 years had required of her, ever since her father, the late Earl of Ashwood, had died leaving behind debts that nobody could fully account for and a family name that had quietly, steadily, begun to crumble at its edges like old plaster. She had endured the reduction of the household, the selling of the horses, the letting go of servants who had been with them since before she was born. She had endured her mother's composure through all of it, that terrifying, gracious composure that never once cracked, not even at the funeral, which Seraphina had found more frightening than any display of grief would have been. And she had been preparing, with every resource of will she possessed, to endure Viscount Pemberton. Then she had gone looking for her embroidery scissors in the wrong room. The study at Ashwood House was meant to be locked. Her mother kept it locked. But the housemaid had been through that afternoon and the latch had not caught properly, and Seraphina, chasing the small domestic errand that was the only kind of purpose the house currently offered her, had pushed the door open without thinking. The desk had been covered in papers. Normally her mother's desk held correspondence, letters in their neat stacks, invitations, household accounts. These papers were different. Seraphina had recognized Pemberton's seal on the uppermost document before she had even crossed the room. She had told herself not to read it. She had read it. By the time she reached the third page, her hands had stopped shaking entirely. She had gone very cold and very still in the way she had learned from watching her mother, the way that meant something had happened that was too large for an immediate response. She had read the document twice. She had replaced every paper in its original order. She had found her embroidery scissors on the windowsill where she'd left them the previous morning and carried them back to the sitting room and sat down and done 45 minutes of extremely precise needlework while she thought. The document was a legal instrument. An agreement, drawn up with the kind of dispassionate professional language that makes monstrous things look merely administrative. It set out, in careful clauses, exactly what Pemberton was purchasing with this marriage, which was not, as it turned out, simply a young wife. It was control of the remaining Ashwood properties, the contents of a trust that Seraphina had not known existed in her own name, and something referred to in the document only as the matter of the correspondence, which was enough to tell her that whatever her mother had been involved in, Pemberton knew all of it. She was not being married. She was being transferred. For 3 whole days she had sat with it. She had watched her mother move through the wedding preparations with serene efficiency. She had smiled at the dressmaker, stood for the fittings, received the calls of congratulation from women who thought she was fortunate. She had looked at Pemberton across her mother's dinner table and watched him eat, and then thought to herself, with absolute clarity, that she would rather be dead. On the morning of the wedding, her lady's maid Nell had dressed her with shaking hands and red eyes, weeping quietly in the way of a girl who knows something she cannot say. Seraphina had not asked what she knew. She had simply held very still while the gown was laced and the veil was pinned, and when Nell's fumbling hands found the stays at the back of the corset, she had felt, and ignored, something stiff and crackling beneath the lining that had not been there at her last fitting. She had walked to the church. She had walked down the aisle. She had stood at the altar and looked at Pemberton's mild pale eyes and thought about the document for the last time. Then she had asked to be excused. And now she was here, in the gardens, being held in the devil's arms. With the sound of boots on the path around the corner of the house and Pemberton's man, she was absolutely certain, coming to collect what his employer had paid for. Lady Seraphina. Dorian's voice was very quiet. He had not moved since setting her down. His eyes were not on her face, they were on the garden gate, measuring something. There are 2 men coming around the eastern wall. I know. You have approximately 40 seconds. I am aware. He looked at her then, fully, with that unsettling inventory gaze that she had always found so objectionable across ballrooms and found, at close range, considerably worse. She could not tell what he was thinking. She was not sure anyone ever could. My carriage, he said, is on the street. I'm not getting into your carriage. You have 30 seconds. I would rather, Seraphina said, with complete sincerity, take my chances with the 2 men coming around the wall. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile, she refused to call it a smile, but it was something. I don't doubt it. But Pemberton's men have instructions to bring you back, and Pemberton's instructions tend to be carried out regardless of what the lady in question would prefer. He paused. I have no such instructions. The boots were louder now. 20 seconds. Perhaps. Seraphina looked at the gate. She looked at the wall, which was too high to climb in a wedding gown without removing several of its architectural layers, and she was not quite desperate enough for that. She looked at the street beyond, where she could see the corner of a very well-appointed black carriage with the Ravenscroft raven on the door. I despise you, she said clearly. I want that established before anything else. Noted, said Dorian Blackwell. 10 seconds. She picked up her skirts and walked through the gate. The inside of the Ravenscroft carriage was exactly what she would have expected from a man who wore nothing but black and had the reputation of a minor villain. Expensive, immaculate, and lacking any unnecessary warmth. Dark leather. Dark wood. A single carriage lamp that threw everything in amber shadow. Seraphina sat with her back to the driver, her wedding gown taking up a thoroughly unreasonable amount of space, and looked at the Duke of Ravenscroft sitting opposite her with his long legs stretched out and his expression entirely unchanged from when he'd been holding her 40 feet below a balcony. She was beginning to suspect the man had only one expression. "You will want to know where I'm taking you," he said. "Ravenscroft House." She had worked that out before they cleared the end of the street. "You would not take me anywhere you did not control." He said nothing, which was confirmation. Outside, London passed in its usual indifferent morning business, costermongers and crossing sweeps and housemaids beating carpets, entirely unbothered by the fact that a woman was sitting in a duke's carriage in a wedding gown, 3 miles from where her groom was presumably discovering her absence. "You need a fiancée," Seraphina said. It was not a question. She had been thinking, hard and fast, since she got in the carriage. The Countess of Wexham's daughter has been put forward for the 3rd consecutive season. Lady Dorothea Finchmorris has had her settlement papers drawn up twice. Your name has been linked to Miss Arabella Stratton since February, which her mother has done nothing to discourage and everything to encourage. She looked at him steadily. You need a reason the ton will believe and a woman visible enough that the matchmaking will stop. You have been looking for a candidate all season. Dorian Blackwell studied her with the expression of a man who has just been handed something he finds genuinely interesting. And I need to not be married to Pemberton. She said it simply. I need shelter, I need time, and I need someone Pemberton cannot easily threaten. She paused. Which, from all available evidence, is you. That is a generous assessment of my character. It is a practical assessment of your reputation. Your character is irrelevant to me. He was quiet for long enough that she could hear the carriage wheels on the cobblestones, the creak of the springs, the distant shout of a street vendor. Then he said, 3 months. The length of the season. You attend the necessary engagements. You are convincing. You answer questions about our attachment with sufficient detail that the ton believes it. At the end of 3 months, we announce a mutual parting of ways. Enough time for me to establish that the season's candidates are not to my taste. Sufficient sympathy for you that you emerge with your reputation in reasonable repair. In reasonable repair, Seraphina repeated. I jumped from my wedding balcony this morning. Yes. The corner of his mouth moved again. That will require some work. My rooms, she said. A lock on the door. My maid Nell brought to the house if she is willing. My movements are my own. I am not a prisoner, I am not a ward, and I will not be managed. She held his gaze. And I want the truth about my father's debt. The carriage went quiet in a different way. That, Dorian said, after a moment that stretched 1 beat too long, is a separate conversation. It is a condition of this one. He looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. She had learned, watching her mother for 22 years, that the most powerful thing a woman in a negotiation could do was refuse to want something too visibly, and she had spent a great deal of time wanting the answer to her father's ruin very visibly, in the privacy of her own skull, and was perfectly capable of keeping it off her face. Agreed, he said finally. The carriage turned onto Grosvenor Square. Ravenscroft House rose at the end of it, enormous and perfectly proportioned and cold in the way of a house that had been built to impress rather than welcome. A butler appeared at the top of the steps before the carriage had fully stopped, which told her that Dorian Blackwell's household ran on a standard of efficiency that bordered on the uncanny. One more condition, Seraphina said, as the footman moved to open the door. Dorian raised an eyebrow. Just one. We do not lie to each other about anything that matters. She met his eyes. You may keep your silences. I will keep mine. But what is said between us directly, that must be true. Something crossed his face then. She could not name it. It was there and gone in the space of a breath, and when it passed his expression was exactly as it had always been. Agreed, he said. She stepped out of the carriage into the pale London morning. The Ravenscroft butler, a man of approximately 60 with the bearing of a retired general and the eyes of someone who had survived a great deal, looked at the wedding gown without blinking. Graves, Dorian said, coming to stand beside her, Lady Seraphina will be our guest for the season. She will require the East Wing rooms, a lady's maid of her choosing, and whatever else she finds necessary. See to it. Of course, Your Grace. Graves's gaze moved to Seraphina. There was something in it, assessment, she thought, and something almost like the beginning of approval. "My lady, welcome to Ravenscroft House." Seraphina followed the butler up the steps. She did not look back at the Duke. She did not let herself think yet about everything she had just agreed to, or everything she had just left behind, or about the stiff crackling thing beneath the lining of her corset that she had felt again, bending to step from the carriage, and that was beginning to feel distinctly like paper. She would think about all of that later. First, she was going to need different clothes. Behind her, Dorian stood at the base of the steps for one more moment before he followed. He was looking toward the end of Grosvenor Square, not at anything in particular, but in the way of a man running rapid calculations and finding, to his considerable surprise, that several of them were coming out in ways he had not anticipated. He had wanted a convenient fiancée. A compliant one, even. Someone biddable enough to play the part without demanding too much and quiet enough that he could continue his actual work undisturbed. Lady Seraphina Ashwood, he thought, as he climbed the steps, was going to be nothing whatsoever like that. He found, disturbingly, that he did not mind. That same evening, long after the household had settled and the candles had been lit and Seraphina had been installed in the East Wing with Nell, who had arrived by hired hackney 3 hours after they did, white-faced and clutching a small bag and refusing to explain why she was shaking, a knock at the East Wing door brought them both upright. It was not Dorian. It was Graves, carrying a note on a silver tray, which he offered to Seraphina with an expression that carefully communicated nothing. She opened it. It was from Dorian. 4 words. "Come to the library." She looked at Nell. Nell looked back with the expression of a girl who had sewn something into a corset lining and was very close to having to explain it. "Nell," Seraphina said quietly, "what did you put in my stays?" Nell's face crumpled. "My lady," she whispered, "I didn't know what else to do with it. They were going to search the house, they said. The night before the wedding, Pemberton's man came and spoke to your mother and she said yes, and I found it in your writing desk and I didn't know where else." "What," Seraphina said, very carefully, "did you find?" Nell reached into her apron pocket with trembling hands and produced a small, slim, leather-bound book. It was not large. It was not impressive. It was battered at the corners and had no title on the cover and looked, from the outside, like nothing of particular consequence. Seraphina took it. She opened it. She read the first page. She turned to the second. She turned to the 5th. She closed it and sat very still. The names on those pages. Lords. Ministers. A bishop. 2 men who sat on the Privy Council. 37 entries, each one more devastating than the last. Dates, payments, private shames, secrets that would end careers and collapse marriages and bring 3 noble houses down like cards in a draft. Pemberton hadn't just been blackmailing people. He had been collecting them. Building an empire of human terror, one secret at a time, for 20 years. And every page of it had been riding against Seraphina's ribs since 9 o'clock that morning. "My lady," Nell said, barely audible. "What does it mean?" Seraphina stood up. She tucked the book into the pocket of her borrowed dressing gown. She looked at Nell with an expression she did not let waver. "It means," she said, "that I need to go to the library." The library at Ravenscroft House was the kind of room that told you everything about its owner that the man himself would never voluntarily reveal. It was vast, 2 full stories of books behind glass-fronted cases, a fire already burning low in the grate despite the late hour, and a desk at the far end that was covered in the organized, purposeful mess of someone who worked here seriously and often. There were no decorative volumes arranged by color or spine. Every book looked read. Several looked read more than once. There was a star chart pinned to a board near the window, annotated in a small precise hand, and a stack of parliamentary reports that had been marked throughout with a boldness that suggested genuine fury at their contents. Dorian was standing at the desk when Seraphina came in. He did not look up immediately. He was reading something, and he finished it before he looked up, which she found either deeply rude or deeply honest and could not decide which. Then he saw her face. "Sit down," he said. "I prefer to stand." "Lady Seraphina." His voice was even. "Sit down." She Saturday. Not because he told her to, she wanted that clear in her own mind, but because her legs had been making a case for sitting for the past hour and she had been overruling them through will alone. She pulled the ledger from her pocket and set it on the desk between them. Dorian looked at it. He looked at her. He picked it up. The library was very quiet. The fire settled. Outside, somewhere on Grosvenor Square, a night watchman called the hour. Dorian read with the same absolute stillness with which he did everything. No change of expression, no sharp intake of breath, nothing that would have told a casual observer what he was absorbing. But Seraphina was not a casual observer. She watched his hands. The fingers on the ledger's edge went white at the knuckles on the 5th page, and then released, and then he turned to the 6th and his jaw did something very slight and very controlled, and she thought, there it is. He set the ledger down. He was quiet for a moment that stretched past comfortable into something else entirely. "How long have you had this?" he said. It was not precisely a question. "Since this morning. I didn't know it was there until tonight." She told him about Nell. About the search. About what Nell had overheard Pemberton's man say to her mother. She told it plainly, without decoration, watching his face for the thing his face would not give her. When she finished, Dorian was quiet again. Then he said, with a precision that told her he was choosing each word deliberately, "Your mother let Pemberton's men into the house to search your rooms?" "Yes." "The morning of your wedding?" "Yes." He looked at the ledger again. Something moved behind his eyes, there and gone, like a fish turning in deep water. "You understand what this is?" 20 years of blackmail. 37 names. Enough to destabilize half the lords and at least 2 men currently advising the crown. She met his gaze. "Yes. I understand what it is. And you brought it here." "I had nowhere else to take it." He was looking at her in a way she had not seen before, not the inventory look, not the controlled assessment of their carriage negotiations. This was something more direct. Something that felt, uncomfortably, like the beginning of respect. "Right," he said, which was not the response she had been expecting. "That's all you have to say. For now." He closed the ledger. "Go to sleep, Lady Seraphina. In the morning we will discuss what comes next. You said you'd tell me about my father's debt." The stillness that came over him then was different from all the others. Denser, somehow. "I said that was a separate conversation. It is now morning adjacent and I have just handed you a book that could bring down the government. I think I have earned a separate conversation." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, quietly, "Not tonight." There was something in the way he said it. Not evasion, something heavier than that. She studied him for a moment, then stood. "Then tomorrow," she said. She left the ledger on his desk. She did not sleep for a very long time. 3 days later, Seraphina Ashwood walked into Almack's assembly rooms on the arm of the Duke of Ravenscroft and felt the precise moment that every conversation in the room stopped, regrouped, and restarted at twice its original volume. She had expected it. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything that frightened her, by thinking about it so thoroughly in private that by the time it arrived in public she could treat it as familiar. The gown was borrowed, one of 3 that Dorian had arranged to appear without comment in her wardrobe. Deep champagne silk that turned her grey-green eyes interesting and made the auburn of her hair look deliberate rather than merely inherited. The Ravenscroft diamonds were not yet at her throat. Too much too fast would signal performance. But there was a single pearl at her ear that had been her grandmother's and had survived every reduction and every sale and was, she felt, adequate. Dorian said nothing as they entered. He did not need to. He simply stood beside her with his hand under hers on his arm and let the room understand that anyone who chose to be unpleasant would be doing so in his direct sightline, which was, by all available evidence, an uncomfortable place to be. Lady Jersey spotted them first. She crossed the floor with the focused velocity of a woman who considers information a blood sport, and Seraphina had her smile assembled and her story straight before the woman got within 6 feet. "My dear Lady Seraphina." Lady Jersey's eyes were doing an extraordinary amount of work behind her pleasant expression. "What an unexpected pleasure." "We had heard," she paused, with the precision of someone who has never said anything imprecisely in their life. "Well, there were a number of accounts." "I imagine there were," Seraphina said warmly. The truth is disappointingly simple, I'm afraid. Pre-wedding nerves of the most acute variety. I am deeply grateful His Grace happened to be passing." She glanced at Dorian with an expression she had practiced exactly once in the mirror that morning and deployed now with surgical confidence. Fond, slightly private, the look of a woman who has recently discovered something pleasing about a man and is not quite ready to share it with the room. Dorian looked back at her. She could not tell what he was thinking. He said, "I remain at Lady Seraphina's service." It was 4 words. They somehow implied volumes. Lady Jersey's gaze moved between them twice, rapidly, with the efficiency of a woman running calculations. Then she smiled, genuinely, which was rarer than the other kind. "How very romantic. We must hear all of it. Come." And just like that, Seraphina Ashwood was no longer a runaway bride. She was a love story. The season, once it accepted the revision, embraced it with characteristic enthusiasm. Hyde Park on a Tuesday was its own theatre, the carriages in their slow, deliberate procession along Rotten Row, the riders showing off horses that were secondary to the showing off of the riders, the careful choreography of who stopped to speak to whom and for how long. Seraphina had always found it faintly absurd. She found it considerably more interesting now that she was one of its primary attractions. She was in Dorian's curricle, an elegant, swift thing that he handled with the casual ease of a man who has been doing it since he was 17, when she saw her mother. Lady Alara was in her own carriage on the far side of the Row, dark-haired and immaculate and looking, from this distance, precisely as she always did, composed, gracious, entirely without guilt. She saw Seraphina at the same moment. Their eyes met across 30 feet of fashionable London Park, and Lady Alara smiled. It was a beautiful smile. It had always been a beautiful smile. "Keep going," Seraphina said quietly. Dorian kept going. He said nothing, but she felt the small adjustment in his hands on the reins, steadying, she thought, as though he knew she needed a moment to put something back in its case before they went any further. She did not thank him. She did not think he would want her to. That evening, the Theatre Royal. Seraphina had always loved the theatre, the suspension of it, the way the world contracted to whatever was lit and moving on the stage. She sat in the Ravenscroft box in her champagne gown and tried very hard to pay attention to the stage. Pemberton had taken the box directly opposite. She knew it before she looked. She felt it, the crawling specific awareness of being watched by someone who considered the watching a form of ownership. She did not turn her head. She kept her eyes on the actors, and her hands relaxed in her lap, and the muscles along her spine screamed with the effort of appearing undisturbed. Beside her, Dorian was utterly still. "He's watching you," she said, very quietly, beneath the swell of the orchestra. "I know." A pause. "He has been for 12 minutes. Are you watching him?" "I have been for 13. The absurdity of it almost, made her want to laugh. She pressed her lips together. "What is he hoping to see?" "That you're frightened." "And am I?" Dorian turned his head then, just slightly, to look at her, properly, not the sidelong assessment of 2 people playing a social game, but directly and without the usual performance of indifference. In the low amber light of the theatre box, his charcoal eyes were darker than usual and entirely serious. "No," he said. "You are not." She turned back to the stage. The warmth of that single word settled somewhere between her shoulder blades and stayed there for the rest of the evening, which she found extremely inconvenient. The dinner party at Lord and Lady Featherington's 3 days later was where everything got considerably more dangerous. Not because of Pemberton, he was not there. Not because of anything as dramatic as confrontation. It was far simpler than that, and therefore far worse. Lady Montrose, 60 years old, 1,000 years of social cruelty, and the specific predatory instinct of a woman who has spent her entire adult life identifying the weakest point in any room, waited until the second course and the conversation was well established before she said, loudly enough to carry, "How remarkable it is to see Lord Ravenscroft so attentive." I confess I had quite given up expecting it. One began to wonder if his attachment to Lady Seraphina was perhaps more convenient than genuine. The table went quiet in the way of people who have been given something they desperately wanted but don't want to be seen wanting. Seraphina felt rather than heard the shift in Dorian beside her. Not anger, He was not a man who announced anger, but something that gathered itself and moved with an absolute purposeful silence, like weather. He set down his fork. He looked at Lady Montrose with an expression that had no heat in it whatsoever and was, for that reason, considerably more alarming than fury would have been. Then, without raising his voice at all, he said, "I find, Lady Montrose, that my attention tends to go where it is genuinely warranted. Lady Seraphina warrants a great deal of it." He paused for exactly one beat. "She is, among all other things, the most honest person I have met in a very long time. I find I have a difficult time looking anywhere else." The silence that followed had a different quality to it. Lady Montrose pursed her lips and found something to say about the fish course. Seraphina looked at her plate. She took a very composed sip of water. Beside her, Dorian picked his fork back up and returned to his meal as though nothing had happened, and she thought, with a small, fierce internal jolt that she was not prepared for, he meant that. Not the performance of it. The thing itself. She was not sure what to do with that information. She filed it somewhere careful and said nothing. They were in the Featherington garden after dinner. The ladies had not withdrawn because Lady Featherington considered the tradition provincial, which was one of the things Seraphina had always liked about her, when Dorian came to stand beside her at the garden wall. The city was below them, London in its evening grey, lamplit and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small particular crisis happening in this specific garden. She asked the question before she had fully decided to. "Was any of what you said in there real?" Dorian was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to employ one of his silences, and she was bracing for it when he said, "Your father's debt." She went still. "He didn't ruin himself," Dorian said. "He was looking at the city, not at her. You know that already, some of it, from whatever you found in your mother's study. But you don't know all of it." He paused. "I knew your father. Not well. But I knew him well enough that when certain financial instruments began circulating in his name, instruments he hadn't signed, backed by accounts that shouldn't have existed, I went to him." The garden was very quiet. Somewhere inside, the piano had started. "He wouldn't listen," Seraphina said. Her voice was level. She had practiced level for 5 years. "He listened. He simply didn't believe it was possible." Dorian turned to look at her then, fully. "He believed your mother implicitly. Completely. Whatever she had told him, and she had told him something, some version designed to discredit any outside account, he held to it. I went back twice. The third time, the documents had already cleared and the debt was established and there was nothing left to do. You tried to stop it. I failed to stop it." He said it without softening it, and she appreciated that more than she could say. "I am not telling you this for absolution. I am telling you because you made an agreement to have the truth and you have been waiting for it with more patience than I deserved." Seraphina looked at him. The piano inside had moved to something slow and low. The lamplight from the garden torches was catching the sharp line of his jaw, and she was thinking, underneath all the information she was carefully processing, that it was extremely unhelpful of him to look like that while telling her something this important. "My mother," she said. "She arranged the debt." "Yes." "Deliberately. Before my father died." "Yes." "And you know why." He met her eyes. Something moved across his face, the first genuine hesitation she had ever seen from him, and somehow that, more than anything else, told her the why was worse than she'd prepared for. "That," he said quietly, "is the conversation we are not having tonight." She wanted to push. Every instinct she had said push. She had waited 5 years and she was standing 3 feet from the answer and her whole body was a wire pulled taut. But she looked at his face and saw, underneath the control and the careful precision, something that looked almost like a man protecting her from a blow he did not yet know how to soften, and she took a breath. "Tomorrow," she said. He nodded. "Once." They went back inside. Neither of them spoke again for the rest of the evening, but when he handed her into the carriage at the end of the night his hand held hers for exactly 1 second longer than was necessary, and she sat with that, alone in the dark of the carriage going home, and told herself very firmly that it meant nothing. She was almost convincing. At Ravenscroft House, Graves met them in the hall with a look that, on a man of his extraordinary professional composure, communicated alarm more effectively than if he'd been waving a flag. "There has been an incident," he said, looking at Seraphina. "Your rooms, my lady. We discovered it an hour ago." She took the stairs without waiting. The door to her east wing rooms was slightly ajar, not forced, not broken, just open the precise, careful amount of someone who had been very professional about the intrusion. Inside, nothing was visibly disturbed. That was the most frightening thing. Whoever had come in had been skilled enough to leave everything looking exactly as it should look. But Seraphina knew her own rooms. She went straight to the writing desk. The third drawer on the left. The false bottom that she had found by accident on her second day and used, with a caution that was now second nature, to store the 3 pages she had carefully copied from the ledger before handing the original to Dorian. The drawer was closed. The false bottom was sealed. The pages were gone. She stood very still. Dorian appeared in the doorway behind her. "They didn't take anything visible," she said. "No." His voice was careful in a new way. "What did they take?" She turned around. "Something I copied. From the ledger. 3 pages, the ones with the most recent entries." She watched his face. Someone in this house knew they were there. The silence was very different from all the silences that had come before it. This one had something moving under it, something cold. "Yes," Dorian said. She stared at him. "You know." "I suspected. Since yesterday." He said it evenly, without excuse. "I was establishing certainty before I told you because I did not want to be wrong about this." "Dorian." She said his given name without deciding to. It stopped him. She could see it, the small involuntary attention of a man hearing his name from a particular voice for the first time. "Who is it?" Before he could answer, Nell appeared from the dressing room doorway, holding an envelope with both hands, her face a perfect study in barely contained terror. "My lady," Nell whispered. "This was under your door when I came up. I didn't know whether." Seraphina took it. She broke the seal. The handwriting was familiar enough to make her chest close. She had been looking at that handwriting her entire life, on birthday notes slipped under nursery doors, on household accounts, on the single letter her mother had sent when Seraphina's father died, for lines long, perfectly composed, containing the word grief but none of its actual substance. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time because the first 2 hadn't made it real enough to act on. "Give him the ledger. Bring it to me personally. Come alone and tell no one. Do this by Friday, or I will give Pemberton something worse than your location. I will give him Dorian's." The room was very quiet. Nell's breathing. The fire. London, outside, going about its enormous indifferent business. Seraphina folded the letter. She put it in the pocket of her gown. When she looked up, Dorian was watching her with the expression she had never been able to fully read, and she understood, with a sudden cold clarity, that whatever her mother was threatening Dorian with, he already knew what it was. "The conversation we are not having tonight," she said softly. "About why she arranged my father's ruin." Dorian said nothing. "It has something to do with you." Still nothing. But his jaw tightened, the smallest fraction, and that was enough. Seraphina crossed the room. She stopped in front of him, close enough to see the precise controlled effort his stillness cost him, and she said, very quietly, "Then I think, Your Grace, that the time for separate conversations is over." He told her at 2 o'clock in the morning, standing in the library with the fire burned down to embers and no candle between them except the one on the corner of the desk, and what he told her rearranged everything she thought she understood about the last 5 years of her life. He did not sit. He stood at the window with his back partially to her, which she understood was not rudeness but the only concession he was capable of making, that telling the truth about this required him to not be looked at directly while he did it. She stayed in the chair. She kept very still and let him speak. He had been working for the Crown since he was 24 years old. Not officially. There was no office, no title, no document that would survive a search of any government building in England. It had begun as a single request from a man he respected, passed on a wet night in a carriage much like the one she had shared with him 3 days ago, and it had never entirely stopped. He had a facility, he said, with the flatness of a man describing something he had never chosen to be proud of, for being underestimated. Men spoke freely around villains. Men confided in rakes. The worse his reputation became, the more useful he was, and he had fed that reputation with the same deliberate precision with which he managed everything else, until the Duke of Ravenscroft and the Crown's most effective intelligence asset occupied the same body with such seamless efficiency that sometimes, he said, with something that was not quite humour and not quite pain, he could not remember which one he had started as. Pemberton had been a target for 3 years. Not simply for the blackmail, though that alone warranted it, but because the silent partner behind the blackmail ring, the one who had been supplying Pemberton with intelligence he should not have been able to access, was someone inside the government itself. Someone close enough to see the dispatches. Close enough to know which secrets were worth the most. Someone who had been selling England's vulnerabilities for 15 years. Seraphina went cold from the inside out. "My mother," she said. He turned from the window then. "Yes." The fire made no sound. The room made no sound. She thought, distantly, about the woman she had watched move through her entire childhood. The composure, the grace, the way no disaster ever seemed to touch her. She thought about her father's face in his last year, bewildered and diminished and reaching for a floor that kept being pulled away beneath him. She was supplying Pemberton, Seraphina said. She needed to say it aloud. Needed to hear it in the air. She found him, or he found her, and she gave him access. Political intelligence. Things my father would have received through his seat, through his contacts, and never once known she was reading. The arrangement began in 1805, Dorian said. By the time I found evidence of it, your father had 18 months left to live and no capacity left to receive the information without destroying him entirely. So you said nothing to him? I said nothing to him. She sat with that. It was not forgiveness. It would take considerably longer than one night to work out what it was, but she understood it. A broken man given a truth that sighs does not recover. He drowns. You've been trying to get to Pemberton and my mother together, she said. That's why you need the ledger. Not just for what it contains, for what connecting it to her intelligence operation would prove. Yes. And when I landed in your garden, you were carrying the ledger. Something crossed his face. I didn't know that then. But yes. When you told me about it that first night, you handed me what I had been looking for 3 years. The silence stretched. Then Seraphina said, with a calm that cost her considerably, I want to be very clear that my cooperation in this matter is about justice for my father and not about being useful to the Crown. I know. And if at any point your Crown obligations conflict with my safety, I will not hesitate to make things extraordinarily difficult for you. I know that too. He almost smiled. I have been aware of that since approximately the second minute of our acquaintance. She stood up. She was tired in the deepest possible way, the kind of tired that comes not from sleeplessness but from finally, after years, understanding the full shape of the thing that has been sitting on your chest. The understanding didn't make it lighter. It just made it visible. The note, she said. My mother wants the ledger by Friday. I know. It's Wednesday. I know. We need a plan, she said. A real one. Not a defensive one. Dorian looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she had not seen him do before. He moved to the desk, pulled out a second chair, set it beside his own, and sat down. An invitation. Precisely calibrated. Not a command. Not a suggestion. She sat beside him. He opened the ledger. They began. By Thursday morning they had a plan. By Thursday afternoon, Cordelia Finch had been sent for. Cordelia arrived at Ravenscroft House in a yellow carriage that was deeply, almost aggressively cheerful against the grey London sky, and she came through the door with the energy of someone who had been waiting to be useful for weeks and was prepared to be extremely good at it. She took one look at Seraphina's face, the composure, the stillness, the carefully managed everything, and crossed the room and put her arms around her without asking permission. Seraphina allowed it for exactly 3 seconds before stepping back and straightening her sleeves. I need you, she said. Obviously, said Cordelia. Tell me everything. She did. Cordelia sat on the library settee with her cornflower eyes growing steadily wider and her untouched tea going cold in her hands, and she did not interrupt once, which was the most extraordinary demonstration of restraint Seraphina had ever witnessed from her. When it was finished, Cordelia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother has been a French spy for 15 years. Yes. And the Duke of Ravenscroft, who everyone thinks is wicked, is secretly working for the crown. Yes. And you have a ledger that could bring down half the House of Lords stitched inside your wedding corset. Was. It's in the desk now." Cordelia looked at the desk. She looked back at Seraphina. "I have had an extremely dull season by comparison." "I need you to be outside on Friday," Seraphina said. "In a hired carriage, on the street where my mother wants to meet. I will not be alone in there. I refuse to be alone in there, but I cannot bring Dorian. She will know." She paused. "I need someone she does not know to watch." Cordelia set down her tea. Something shifted in her face, the dimples and the brightness falling back to reveal something considerably steadier underneath. "I'll be there," she said simply. The meeting with Lady Alara was held in a private parlour in a discreet townhouse in Marylebone, the kind of address that existed specifically for conversations that could not be had in drawing rooms or clubs or anywhere that mattered. Lady Alara was already there when Seraphina arrived, seated with a cup of tea she had clearly poured from the pot on the table, as composed as though this were an afternoon call. She looked beautiful. She always looked beautiful. Seraphina had inherited her colouring and her bone structure and spent years being grateful for it without ever once examining what she felt about the source. "My darling," Lady Alara said, and her voice held every note of warmth that Seraphina had heard in it her entire childhood. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand." Her mother's gaze travelled over her, assessing, fond, entirely unsurprised. "You always were stubborn. You get that from your father." The warmth in her voice when she said it was genuine, and that was what made it devastating. She had loved him, Seraphina thought. In whatever way she was capable of love, she had loved him. "Tell me one true thing," Seraphina said. "Before anything else. One true thing about why." Lady Alara was quiet. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, Cordelia was in a hired carriage on the street below, and knowing that was the thing that kept Seraphina's hands still at her sides. "I was 19 years old," Lady Alara said, finally, "when they first approached me. I was not yet your father's wife. We were not yet engaged. I was the second daughter of a baron who was already in debt, and I had 3 younger sisters and no prospects that did not involve a great deal of careful management." She paused. "They offered security. Permanence. A guarantee that regardless of what happened in the vagaries of marriage and fortune and the particular cruelties that this world reserves for women, I would never be without resources." "So you married father to access his intelligence connections?" "I married your father," Lady Alara said, with a precision that was its own kind of answer, "because I loved him, and because it was also practical, and I have spent 30 years refusing to feel guilt about holding both of those things at once." Seraphina looked at her mother's face and understood, with a clarity that felt like swallowing glass, that this woman would never crack. Not because she felt nothing, but because she had made her decisions with full comprehension of their cost, and she had paid the cost, and she considered the ledger closed. "Pemberton," Seraphina said. "What does he have on you?" "Everything. Which is why you are going to give me the ledger." Lady Alara set down her cup. "Seraphina, listen to me carefully. Pemberton has promised that if the ledger is returned, the arrangement ends. You are free of the marriage. I am free of him. It is clean. Nothing about this is clean. Cleaner than the alternative." Her mother's voice did not change. "Because if Pemberton decides to move against Ravenscroft, and he will, if this continues, what he releases will not simply damage Dorian's reputation. It will end his life. The kind of work Dorian does for the crown, exposed publicly with sufficient evidence, is not a scandal. It is a noose." The room was very still. "And if you think you know where this is going, I promise you, you don't."
Before we get to what happens next, if you are watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now. This channel is where the best Regency romance stories live, and we are just getting to the part that will keep you up at night. Like this video, drop a comment telling me your favorite character so far and the country you're watching from. Share this with someone who needs a good story, because it is about to get considerably worse before it gets better. Now, back to the parlor in Marylebone, where Seraphina Ashwood has just been told that the man she is trying very hard not to be in love with is one wrong move away from a noose.
Seraphina gave her mother a copy. She had made two, on the same night she and Dorian made their plan, saying nothing about it to him because she had not yet decided whether she trusted anyone fully enough to explain every move she intended to make. The real ledger was in a place she had not told Dorian about, behind the loose brick at the base of the east wing fireplace, discovered by Seraphina on a restless night of pacing her room, because old houses always had loose bricks and she had always been the kind of person who checked. She watched her mother take the copy and did not allow her face to do anything at all. Walking out of that parlor was one of the hardest things she had ever done. Not because she wanted to stay. Because she had to leave everything she had ever wanted to say to that woman sitting unspoken in a Marylebone parlor, and she might never have another opportunity, and the luxury of saying it was one she could not currently afford. She got into Cordelia's carriage. She sat down. Cordelia took one look at her and said nothing, which was the greatest gift she had ever given. Seraphina looked out the window at the street. Then the thing she had been holding together with nothing but the architecture of necessity shifted. Once, a single seismic movement, and she pressed her hand over her mouth and closed her eyes, and for exactly 60 seconds she let herself feel the full weight of it. Her father's face. The debts. The wedding gown. 5 years of a story she had been living inside without knowing who wrote it. Then she opened her eyes and straightened her spine and said, "Take me back to Ravenscroft House." Cordelia took her hand and held it the entire way, saying nothing, which was the precisely correct thing. Dorian was in the library when she arrived, and he was not alone. The man sitting opposite him was slight, sandy-haired, and possessed of an expression so relentlessly sardonic that it appeared to be his natural resting state. He was perhaps 35, dressed with the careful understatement of a man who does not wish to be remembered, and he was holding Dorian's copy of 3 pages of the ledger with the focused attention of someone doing arithmetic in his head. He looked up when Seraphina came in. His eyes sharpened with a particular assessment of a man who evaluates people professionally and quickly. "Lord Edmund Ashby," Dorian said, by way of introduction. "He is adjacent to Whitehall." "Adjacent," Edmund said, "is generous. I am several rooms away from Whitehall at all times, and my name does not appear on any document that matters, which is exactly how I prefer it." He looked at Seraphina. "You're less frightened than I expected." "I'm more frightened than I appear," she said evenly. "I've simply had a great deal of practice." Something shifted in Edmund's expression, a small recalibration, slightly warmer. He looked at Dorian. "I like her." "Noted," Dorian said, in a tone that suggested the notation had been made and filed under categories he was not prepared to examine. "What did she tell you?" This was addressed to Seraphina. She told them both about the meeting, all of it, including what her mother had said about Dorian's exposure, which she delivered straight and clean because there was no other way to do it. When she finished, Edmund tapped the pages in his hand against his knee. "The copy she gave Lady Alara will reach Pemberton within 24 hours, Edmund said. "He'll know immediately it's not the original, the paperweight is wrong, the ink is too fresh. He'll know she tried." "I know," Seraphina said. Both men looked at her. "Which means he'll move," she said. "Before Friday. Before we expect it. He'll move because he's been patient for 3 weeks, and patience has limits even for men like Pemberton, and being handed a copy instead of the original is precisely the kind of insult that ends patience." She looked at Dorian. When and where would he choose to move? Dorian was quiet for exactly 1 second. "Somewhere public," he said. "Somewhere a scene would be costly. He doesn't want a scene, he wants compliance. He'll want you frightened and isolated and with enough witnesses present that any cry for help becomes its own embarrassment." "Lady Harcastle's masquerade," Edmund said. The silence that followed had a shape to it. Lady Harcastle's masquerade was the following evening, the most attended event of the second half of the season, famous for its excess and its anonymity, 500 people behind silk masks in a house large enough to lose entire scandals in. "He'll expect you to be frightened," Dorian said. He was looking at her with the full force of that charcoal gaze, and she understood he was not telling her something she didn't already know. He was verifying something about her. He'll expect compliance. Then he is going to have a very educational evening, Seraphina said. She had never worn a mask to a masquerade before and found, arriving at the Harcastle house in deep midnight blue silk with Cordelia at her side and Dorian a half-step behind, that there was something both freeing and deeply unsettling about a room full of people whose faces were half hidden. Everything moved differently under concealment. Laughter was louder. Movement was looser. The usual architecture of social constraint had shifted, and what remained was rawer and more unpredictable. Dorian had barely let go of her arm before she felt the first one. A hand at her elbow, light, professional, the kind of touch designed to feel like an accident. Then a second. Then the crowd closed in the particular deliberate way of a crowd being managed by people who knew how to manage one, and she was 3 steps further from Dorian than she had been, and then 6, and then she could not see him at all. She did not struggle. Struggling in a crowd of this kind produced exactly nothing except attention of the wrong sort. She let herself be guided, memorizing every face she could see above every mask, noting the direction, counting the doors. They took her up a staircase she had not previously identified and through a corridor that smelled of beeswax and old oak, and then a door opened and she was in a sitting room, small and private and lamplit, and the door closed behind her. Pemberton was standing at the fireplace. Without the social armor of a public room around him, he looked different. Older. The florid complexion deepened to something that was less hearty and more dangerous, and the mild pale eyes had lost their performance of blandness. He looked at her with the flat, specific attention of a man who has decided that patience was a strategy and is now choosing a different one. "Lady Seraphina," he said, "you look very well. Marriage would have suited you." "Strangely," she said, "I found these past weeks have suited me considerably better." He was not a man who flushed. He simply became, very slightly, more still. "The copy your mother brought me was charming. The paper was from Ravenscroft House. I recognize the watermark. Blackwell's private stock. A thoughtful touch." He tilted his head. "The original, if you please. Before midnight. Or I will send what I have about the Duke's activities to 3 specific members of the Lords who have been waiting for exactly this kind of material since 1811. Men who, I assure you, will not be dilatory about acting on it." Seraphina looked at him across the room. She thought, quite clearly, about the past 3 weeks. The carriage and the library and the garden wall and the theatre box and the dinner table and 2 o'clock in the morning. And a man who had spent 6 years being a monster so that monsters would trust him. "You'll want to be very certain of your evidence before you move against Ravenscroft," she said. "The kind of man who has been working against you for 3 years tends to have planned for the contingency of being threatened." Pemberton smiled. It was the most unpleasant thing she had ever seen. "My dear girl, you have no idea what I have planned for." He moved toward the door. "Midnight. Tell Blackwell I said good evening." He left. The room was very quiet. Seraphina stood in the center of it and breathed, slowly, and opened her right hand, which she had been holding carefully closed since the moment Pemberton crossed the room toward the door and passed within 18 inches of her. In her palm, caught in the precise careful second she had stepped aside to let him pass, was a small oval of engraved silver. A personal seal, the Pemberton crest, the one he carried in his breast pocket. She had seen it in every previous encounter, the habit of a man who sealed his own correspondence personally. The seal that, pressed into wax on any document, proved it originated with Pemberton. The seal that, attached to the right evidence, proved he had known about the forged documents that ruined her father. She closed her hand around it again and looked at the door. Then it opened, and Dorian came through it with the controlled velocity of a man who had been working very hard to move calmly, and behind him Edmund Ashby with rather less pretense of calm. Dorian's eyes went straight to her face. She read the question in them, the one he would never ask out loud in front of Edmund, which was not "Are you hurt?" but something more specific and more personal than that. She answered it by holding up her closed fist and opening it. Dorian looked at the seal in her palm. Something moved through his expression, complex and rapid and then controlled again, but not before she had seen it. "He didn't give anything away," she said. "But he has 3 lords ready to move against you. Men from 1811. He said they've been waiting for material like this." Edmund swore, softly, under his breath. Dorian said nothing. He looked at the seal. He looked at her. And then something happened that she had not expected. He looked away. Out the window. Into the dark of the Harcastle garden below. And she saw, in the rigid set of his shoulders and the absolute quality of his stillness, that whatever Pemberton had been intending to send to those lords, it was real. Not fabricated. Real. Dorian. She said his name the same way she had in the East Wing corridor, and it had the same effect, that small involuntary attention, his gaze returning to her face as though it had no other option. Whatever it is, tell me. He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that Edmund Ashby found something to examine on the opposite wall with tremendous sudden interest. There are things I have done in service of the Crown, Dorian said, quietly, that I would do again. And things I would not. The distinction between those two categories is not one that a House of Lords committee would entertain very carefully. He paused. If Pemberton releases what he has, it will not matter what the truth is. The truth is rarely what matters in these situations. Then we move first, Edmund said from the window, no longer pretending he wasn't listening. We move tonight, Seraphina said. Both men looked at her. She closed her fingers around the seal. He doesn't know I have this. He thinks he walked out of here with every advantage. He will go back to whatever private room he operates from and he will feel, for the rest of this evening, entirely secure. She met Dorian's eyes. How long do you need? Dorian held her gaze. She watched him calculate, not whether it was possible, she could see he already knew it was possible, but something else. Something that had to do with her specifically and the seal in her hand and the question of how much he was prepared to let someone else carry. He was not, she suspected, very good at that. 6 hours, he said. You have 5, Edmund said. The Lords meet at 7. Then I'll need the seal authenticated before 4. Dorian looked at Seraphina. You're certain he didn't suspect? He was very busy being certain of his own cleverness, she said. He had no attention to spare. Edmund made the sound of a man revising an opinion upward. I'll go ahead, he said, already moving to the door. Dorian, the usual route. 20 minutes. He paused at the door and looked at Seraphina. You should know, Lady Seraphina, that in 15 years of doing very particular work, I have met perhaps 4 people with the instinct you have just demonstrated. He nodded, once, with the gravity of a man who does not give compliments as a practice. Then he was gone. The room was smaller without him in it. Or perhaps it was only that Dorian was looking at her in a way that took up a considerable amount of available space. I could have managed it, he said. I know, she said. But you didn't have to. He was very still. The lamplight was low and the distant sound of the masquerade below continued its oblivious orchestral swell. 500 people behind silk masks dancing through a night that had no idea what was being decided in a small upstairs sitting room. Seraphina. His voice was different. Not the controlled evenness. Something underneath it, breaking the surface. She looked at him and waited. When this is over, he said, and then stopped. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who could not find the right words, not because he lacked them, but because none of them were sufficient and he was too honest to use insufficient ones. When this is over, she said gently, we will have a separate conversation. Something crossed his face that she thought, that she was almost certain, was relief. Raw, unguarded, and gone in an instant. Come on, she said. You have 5 hours. She walked to the door. He followed. And in the corridor outside, before the noise and the movement of the masquerade swallowed them both again, he fell into step beside her, close enough that their hands were nearly touching, not quite touching, and she thought, with a clarity that had nothing to do with strategy or ledgers or the long, necessary business of dismantling a villain. She was not going to be finished with him when this was over. She was, in fact, fairly certain she was only just beginning. But the night was not finished yet. Because when they reached the top of the staircase and looked down at the glittering, masked, oblivious crowd below, Seraphina saw something that stopped her one step from the first stair. Lady Alara was there, in the ballroom, standing at the edge of the crowd in deep sapphire silk, her dark hair perfect, her posture composed. She was not looking at the dancing. She was not looking at the crowd. She was looking directly at Seraphina. And she was not alone. The man beside her was someone Seraphina did not recognize. Slight, sharp-featured, dressed with the careful nondescript quality of someone who did not want to be placed or remembered. He was looking at Dorian. Dorian went still beside her. Not the controlled stillness of his public performance. The other kind. The kind she had seen only once, in the garden, when she had handed him information that cost him. "Dorian," she said carefully. "Who is that man?" Dorian's voice, when it came, was the quietest she had ever heard it. "That," he said, "is the reason nothing about tonight is going to go the way we planned." His name was Renaud. That was the only name Dorian gave her, spoken low and without looking away from the man at Lady Alara's side, and it told Seraphina almost nothing except that Dorian knew him, and that knowing him had done something to the carefully maintained architecture of Dorian's composure that nothing else in 3 weeks had managed. "He works for the French," Dorian said. "Still quiet. Still not moving. He has been in London for 11 days. I know this because I have had 2 men watching the docks for precisely this eventuality for the past 3 months." A pause. "I was told he had not arrived." "Clearly," Seraphina said, "someone told you incorrectly." "Clearly." The word was flat. "Dangerous. Which means one of my 2 men is not my man at all." Below them, the masquerade continued its brilliant, ignorant waltz. Renaud had not moved. Lady Alara had not moved. They were simply standing at the edge of the ballroom in the particular stillness of people who have identified their target and are waiting for the geometry of the room to become favorable. "They're not here for the ledger," Seraphina said. "No. They're here because Pemberton told them we were moving tonight. Someone told Pemberton we were moving tonight." Dorian said nothing, which was confirmation of the worst kind. Seraphina ran it backward in her head, the plan they had made in the library, the 3 people who had known it, herself, Dorian, Edmund. And then she thought about Edmund leaving the room before them, taking the usual route, 20 minutes ahead. "Where is Edmund?" she said. Dorian was already moving. He took her arm, not with the performative elegance of their public appearances, but with the directness of a man who needs someone he trusts exactly where he can see them, and they descended the staircase together into the glittering chaos of the masquerade. He did not go toward Renaud. He went sideways, using the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who had done this in worse rooms than Lady Harcastle's ballroom, keeping bodies between them and the 2 figures at the edge of the floor. They found Edmund in the card room. He was sitting at a table with 3 other men, cards in hand, performing relaxation with the specific focus of someone who has been trained to perform it. When Dorian sat down across from him and Seraphina took the adjacent chair, Edmund did not look up from his cards immediately. He took his turn. He set down a 7 of spades. Then he said, without raising his voice above the conversational noise of the room, "Renaud is here." "I know," Dorian said. "He arrived with a letter of transit that should not exist. Someone in the Home Office signed it." Edmund finally looked up, and his sardonic expression had been replaced with something considerably more stripped down. "We have a problem that is larger than Pemberton. Tell me something I don't know." Lady Alara did not bring him here tonight. Edmund glanced at Seraphina, brief, apologetic, honest. "Renaud brought himself. Your mother, Lady Seraphina, has been attempting to disentangle herself from the French operation for 2 years. Renaud is here because his superiors have decided that a spy who wants to retire is a liability, not an asset." He paused. "He is not here for the ledger. He is here to ensure Lady Alara does not survive long enough to speak to anyone official." The card room noise continued. Someone laughed too loudly at the far table. A footman moved through with a tray of glasses. Seraphina sat with what Edmund had just said and felt it reconfigure everything. Her mother, cold, calculating, composed Lady Alara, who had engineered the ruin of her own husband and sold her daughter into a grotesque marriage, had been trying to get out. For 2 years. And had said nothing. Because there was nothing to say that did not end in prison or worse, and Lady Alara was, above everything, a woman who understood the odds. "She came here tonight," Seraphina said slowly, "because she knew Renaud would follow her. And she knew we would be here." Both men looked at her. She led him to us deliberately, Seraphina said. Because we are the only people in this building who have any reason to keep her alive. The silence at the card table had a very different texture from the rest of the room. She is, Edmund said carefully, either the most coldly calculating person I have encountered in 15 years of very particular work. Yes, Seraphina said. She is. Dorian was looking at her with an expression she could not read and did not have time to examine. He stood up from the table. He leaned down and said something in Edmund's ear that she could not hear, and Edmund nodded once with the expression of a man receiving orders he considers correct and will carry out with extreme efficiency. Then Dorian looked at Seraphina. "Stay beside me," he said. "Not behind me. Beside me." She stood up. "Always." They found Lady Alara exactly where they had left her, at the edge of the ballroom, in her sapphire gown, still and composed as ever. But Renaud was no longer beside her, and the way Lady Alara's eyes moved when she saw them coming, rapid, fractional, professional, told Seraphina that the composure was costing her something considerable. "His moved," Lady Alara said, when they were close enough. "No greeting. No performance. Just information, delivered with the directness of a woman who had run out of time for anything else. He went through the east door 4 minutes ago. There is a man with him I do not recognize." "We have people on the east door," Dorian said. "Your people on the east door are not the difficulty." Lady Alara's gaze moved to Dorian and stayed there, assessing him with the focused intensity of a woman doing it for the first and possibly last time. "The difficulty is that Renaud did not come here only for me. He came because his organization has decided that the ledger represents a risk they cannot allow to reach the government. Every name in that book includes the method of their compromise. Several of those methods trace back to French intelligence operations." She paused. "They want it destroyed. And they want anyone who has read it unable to testify." "That would be the 3 of us," Seraphina said. "And your friend Edmund Ashby, yes." Lady Alara finally looked at her daughter. Something moved through her expression, complicated, layered, not simple enough to be called guilt and not simple enough to be called love, but somewhere in the difficult territory between the two. "I could not send word without Renaud knowing. I could not come to you directly. The only move I had was to be somewhere you would be and trust that you were clever enough to understand it." "I understood it," Seraphina said. Her mother looked at her for a long moment. "I know you did." Something in her face shifted, the smallest possible admission of something she had never been built to say directly. "You have always been cleverer than I planned for." There was a full lifetime of conversation compressed into that sentence, and neither of them had the time to unpack it. Seraphina heard it, held it somewhere careful, and set it aside. "The ledger is at Ravenscroft House," she said. "Not here. Renaud can search this building for the rest of the evening." "He won't search," Dorian said. "He was watching the east door. He'll wait. He'll let the crowd thin and he'll take whoever he can reach when the geometry is right." He looked at Lady Alara. "How many men does he have?" "4 that I saw. Possibly 6. Edmund can manage 6. "Edmund," Lady Alara said precisely, "is 1 man. Edmund," Dorian said, with the first trace of something that might have been dark humor, "is considerably more than that." As though to illustrate the point, there was a brief, contained commotion near the east corridor. Not enough to disturb the dancing, not enough to bring anyone running, just the specific quality of disturbance that happens when something is dealt with swiftly and professionally in a small space. A single crash. Silence. Then the east door opened and Edmund came through it, adjusting his cuffs with the expression of a man who has just won at cards. He crossed to them and said, without breaking stride, 2 of the 6. The other 4 are on the terrace. We should leave." They left. The carriages were brought around with the efficiency that characterized everything at Ravenscroft House, and they went, all 4 of them, which made for an unusual carriage configuration, through the London night with the particular swift silence of people who have just extracted themselves from a situation by the thinnest possible margin and are not yet sure the margin holds. Seraphina sat beside her mother. It had not been planned. There were only so many seats. But she was aware, acutely, of the proximity, the familiar profile, the particular way Lady Alara held herself even now, even in a rocking carriage at speed through the dark city, with a posture that refused to admit any difficulty whatsoever. "When this is over," Seraphina said quietly, so that only her mother could hear, "I need you to understand something." Lady Alara turned her head. "I am not going to pretend that what you did was survivable because we survived it," Seraphina said. "Father did not survive it. I lived 5 years in the wreckage of it. I was 3 minutes from being sold into a marriage that would have destroyed me." She held her mother's gaze. "I am not telling you this so that you will feel it. I suspect you already feel more than you have ever allowed anyone to see. I am telling you because I want you to know that I know. All of it. And that I am choosing what I do with that knowledge with my eyes completely open." Lady Alara was silent for the length of 3 streets. "You are," she said finally, "so entirely your father's daughter." It was not an apology. It was not absolution or explanation or the tearful reckoning that lesser storytelling would have required. It was simply the truest thing her mother had ever said to her, and Seraphina held it like the complicated, painful, genuine thing it was, and turned to look out the window at London passing in the dark. Across the carriage, Dorian was watching her. She did not look at him. She did not need to. She could feel it. Ravenscroft House received them all with Graves's extraordinary composure, for people arriving past midnight from a masquerade with varying degrees of emergency on their faces, one of whom was the woman who had tried to have the house searched 3 weeks ago, and he managed the whole situation with the expression of a man for whom nothing constituted a genuine surprise anymore. Tea appeared. Then something stronger. Edmund spread his documents across the library table, and the 4 of them worked through the remaining hours of the night with the focused grimness of people who understand that the morning will not wait. The plan that emerged was not elegant. Elegant had been the previous plan, and the previous plan had met Renaud, and now they had something more functional and considerably less pretty. Edmund would take the ledger and Lady Alara's testimony, which she gave, sitting at Dorian's library table at 3 o'clock in the morning in her sapphire masquerade gown, with a precise comprehensive detail of a woman who has been mentally preparing this testimony for 2 years, directly to Lord Castlereagh, whose particular combination of power and incorruptibility made him the only man Edmund trusted to act before Pemberton's lords could be mobilized. Dorian would handle the remaining members of Pemberton's network through channels that he described as the usual ones and that Seraphina chose not to require specifics about. And Renaud's 4 men on the terrace would be collected by dawn by people whose names Edmund also did not provide. Pemberton himself was the cleanest part, which none of them had expected. The seal in Seraphina's palm, authenticated against his known correspondence by 2 experts Edmund produced at 4 in the morning from locations that suggested he kept experts in reserve for exactly this kind of hour, was enough. Combined with the ledger, combined with Lady Alara's testimony, combined with the financial instruments bearing the forged signatures that Dorian retrieved from a locked drawer in his desk with the matter-of-fact ease of a man who has been keeping evidence for 3 years and always knew he would use it. The thing that had taken Dorian 6 years and cost her father his life and cost Seraphina her own without her knowledge came together in a library at 4 in the morning with the unglamorous efficiency of people who are simply very tired and very determined. And when Edmund left before dawn with a leather case under his arm and Lady Alara beside him in a separate carriage heading for a Crown safe house in Kensington, the library felt suddenly enormously quiet. Dorian closed the door. He stood with his hand on it for a moment, his back to the room, and Seraphina sat in the chair by the fire that was now down to its last serious warmth and looked at the back of his head and thought about everything she had been not thinking for 3 weeks. He turned around. He looked exhausted in a way she had never seen on him. Not weak. Nothing about Dorian Blackwell was ever weak, but stripped. The performance layers gone. The controlled stillness present not as a performance but simply as the bedrock of who he was, and underneath it something that was looking at her the way it had been looking at her for a very long time and was apparently no longer interested in being managed. "It's over," he said. "Most of it," she said. "The trials will take time. Edmund's lords will be unpleasant about it. There will be people who don't believe my mother's testimony until they have no choice." "Yes." He was still looking at her. "I meant between us." The fire settled. Outside, London was doing the thing it did in the last hour before dawn, a peculiar, held-breath quiet, as though the city was briefly, accidentally sincere. "The arrangement," he said. "The terms we agreed in the carriage. 3 months, the length of the season." He moved away from the door. He came to stand before the fireplace, not close to her, not yet, but close enough that the quality of the air between them changed. The season ends in 6 weeks. I'm aware of when the season ends. I'm not asking you to leave when it does. He said it directly. No ornamentation. No careful construction. Just the thing itself. I'm telling you that the practical reasons for your presence here, the arrangement, the cover it provided, what it gave both of us, I would like to separate those from the other reasons. The ones that have nothing to do with Pemberton or the Crown or the Ledger or any of it. Seraphina looked up at him. The firelight was doing something honest to his face, all the angles and the controlled severity still there, but nothing hidden behind them anymore. He looked like what he was, a man who had spent 6 years being a constructed thing and was standing in front of her at 4 in the morning in his own library, being something considerably more undefended. "You're not good at this," she said. "No," he agreed. "I am not. You are going to have to be more specific." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I would like you to stay. Not as my fiancée. Not as a convenient arrangement. I would like you to stay because I find that the prospect of you not being in this house is one I am genuinely unwilling to consider, and I have been unwilling to consider it for approximately 2 weeks, and I am telling you now because if I wait for a better moment one of us will have been shot by a Frenchman and the whole thing will be moot." Seraphina stood up. He went very still. She crossed the distance between them until she was standing directly in front of him, close enough to see the particular quality of the effort his stillness was costing him. She looked at his face, the sharp jaw, the dark eyes, all of it so relentlessly familiar now that she could not find the version of it she had hated for 5 years anywhere in her memory. It had been replaced, she suspected sometime around the garden wall at the Featherington party, by something she found considerably more difficult. "You tried to save my father," she said. "I failed to save your father." "You tried." She held his gaze. "You have been carrying that for 6 years. I can see it. I'm not going to pretend I can't." She paused. "I am also not going to let you keep carrying it as though it belongs to you. It belongs to Pemberton. And my mother. And every mechanism of a world that made what they did possible. A breath. Not to you." He said nothing, but something in his face moved, a shift so deep and so carefully guarded that she understood it had not moved in a very long time, and watching it was one of the most intimate things she had ever witnessed. "I am also," she said, slightly quieter, "in love with you. I want that established before anything else." The corner of his mouth moved. Then the other corner. It was the first time she had seen his whole face do it, a real smile, helpless and ungoverned and nothing like the controlled almost expressions she had been cataloguing for 3 weeks, and it was, devastating was not too strong a word, she decided. Absolutely devastating. "Noted," he said. "Is that all you have to say?" "No." He reached out and took her hand, not with the careful propriety of their public performances, not with the urgency of emergency, just the steady, deliberate certainty of a man who has decided and does not do things by half measures. "But I thought I would match your approach. Establish the most important thing first." "Which is?" "That I am completely, irrevocably, and with absolutely no remaining capacity for pretending otherwise, in love with you." He said it the way he said everything that mattered, directly, without decoration, as though the truth needed no assistance to be sufficient. "I believe I have been since you looked up at me in that garden and told me you despised me, and I found it the most refreshing thing anyone had said to me in 6 years. Seraphina looked at him for one more moment. Just one. Memorizing the specifics of this, the library, the dying fire, the pre-dawn silence, the hand holding hers, because she was the kind of person who stored things carefully. Then she reached up with her free hand and pulled him down by the lapel of his very excellent coat, and kissed him. He kissed her back with the focused, unhurried certainty with which he did everything else, and neither of them came up for air for a very considerable time. When they did, she was still holding the lapel. He was looking at her with an expression that had none of his usual layers and everything else, and his other hand was at her jaw with a gentleness that was entirely inconsistent with his reputation and entirely consistent with everything she now knew about who he actually was. "The announcement," he said. "The real one," she said. "It will cause a considerable amount of discussion." "We have been causing considerable discussion since I fell on you in a garden in a wedding gown," she said. "I think we're past worrying about it." Something in his chest moved. Laughter, she realized, with a small internal shock of delight. Low and genuine, and nothing like the public performance of amusement. She felt it more than heard it and decided, privately and with great conviction, that she intended to cause it as frequently as possible for the foreseeable future. 6 weeks later, at the season's last and most attended ball of the year, held at the Devonshire house with 450 guests and enough candlelight to read by at the bottom of the garden, Seraphina Ashwood became the Duchess of Ravenscroft with rather less ceremony than the occasion theoretically warranted and rather more genuine celebration than either of them had anticipated. Pemberton's trial had begun the previous Tuesday. It was not going well for Pemberton, which meant it was going precisely as it should. 3 of his lords had already cooperated enthusiastically in exchange for the particular mercy that cooperation tends to attract. 6 more were having a very careful, very quiet autumn in their country houses. 2 men from the Privy Council had resigned citing health, which was the kind of health that consists of having been found out. Lady Alara was in Kensington and then, after 2 weeks of careful conversation with Edmund and the relevant Crown authority, in a quiet house in Bath. She wrote to Seraphina once. The letter was 4 pages long, which was 3.5 pages longer than any letter Seraphina had received from her before. She read it twice and wrote back a single page and put the whole correspondence in the careful place where she kept the things that were true and complicated and not yet fully resolved, because she was 22 years old and had time to work out what a relationship with a woman like her mother could honestly look like, and she was not going to rush it into a shape it wasn't ready for. Renaud had returned to France, which Edmund described as a temporary situation. Edmund himself was at the Devonshire ball, in the corner, with a glass of something he had brought himself because he found the Devonshire house wine inadequate, watching the room with his habitual sardonic attention and looking, if you knew him well enough to read it, genuinely pleased. Cordelia was not in a corner. Cordelia was in the middle of everything, in a gown of impossible rose silk that she had described as understated and which was anything but, and she was talking to a tall red-haired man in a military coat who was listening to her with the focused astonishment of someone who has never encountered anything quite like her and cannot decide whether to be alarmed or delighted. He appeared to be settling on delighted. Seraphina made a note to ask about him later. Graves was visible, briefly, through the entrance hall, directing something with the quiet authority of a man who considers all events, regardless of venue, to fall under his purview. He caught Seraphina's eye across the hall and permitted himself the expression she had been cataloguing since her first morning at Ravenscroft House. It was, she had concluded, satisfaction. It had always been satisfaction. She was standing at the edge of the ballroom, her ballroom now, her people now, her ridiculous glittering improbable life now, in a gown the colour of midnight and the Ravenscroft diamonds cold and heavy at her throat, when Dorian came to stand beside her. He did not speak immediately. That was still his way, and she had stopped finding it unsettling and started finding it one of the things she was most grateful for, that he understood the value of silence, and what to do with it, and when to end it. Lady Montrose, he said quietly, after a moment, has been telling 3 different people that she always knew we were genuinely attached. Seraphina kept her eyes on the dancing. Of course she has. Lady Jersey has written to inform me that she considers our story the most satisfying development of the season. She is not wrong. He turned to look at her, the full attention, the charcoal eyes, the whole of it, uncalculated and unarmored. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was the simplest question he had ever asked her and the one she had least expected, and she turned to look at him properly and thought about it with the same seriousness she gave everything that mattered. She thought about the balcony, the garden, the carriage, the library at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, for in the morning, all the hours they had sat across the same desk unravelling the same tangled impossible thing. She thought about the theatre box and the garden wall and the moment his face had done something real and helpless and devastating, and all the mornings after, all the ordinary extraordinary mornings of being known by someone who had seen every corner of her and stayed. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, against her temple, low enough that only she could hear it, for words that were dry and precise and utterly Dorian and somehow, for exactly that reason, the most romantic thing she had ever heard in her life. She laughed, a real one, unguarded, the kind she had stopped herself having for 5 years because the habit of joy had felt like a luxury she could not afford. Dorian watched her laugh with the expression of a man who has decided this is one of his primary objectives and is already planning how to achieve it regularly. Then he offered her his hand, and she took it, and they stepped out together onto the floor while the ton watched with the collective breathless delight of people who have been following a story since a woman in a wedding gown fell from a balcony into a duke's arms, and have the enormous satisfaction of having been there from the very beginning. 450 candles. 450 witnesses. And two people who had found each other through the most catastrophic and improbable and perfectly necessary sequence of disasters that London had produced in a very long time, moving through the last dance of the season like they had always known how. Which, in the way that mattered most, they had.
If this story kept you going until the very last word, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel was made for. Please like this video right now. It truly helps more than you know. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the next story is already coming and it is going to hit just as hard. Drop a comment below and tell me, did you fall for Dorian in the garden scene, or did he win you over in the library? I need to know. Share this with someone who loves a good Regency romance, and we will see you in the next one.